Hello and welcome to another edition of the William Buck CPD program. My name is Frank Devoli and I'm here with Garth O'Connor-Price. And today we're going to go through preference demands and specifically what you can do if your client or you receive a preference demand. So we're going to start off with a case study to provide some background information that will flow throughout the whole presentation. So your client, Dunkley Food Supplies, is a company which operates a wholesale food supply business. A major customer of Dunkley was an independent supermarket retailer, Western Gourmet Foods. On 15th of May in year 3, Western entered voluntary liquidation with L Beverage appointed as the liquidator. On 15th of September in that same year, Dunkley received a preference demand from Mr. Beveridge for 4 payments totaling $100,000, which were claimed to be unfair preferences and voidable under the Corporations Act. Mr. Beveridge was demanding that these amounts be repaid to Western, and enclosed with his demand, there were Western bank statements showing each payment which was made, a detailed solvency report completed by the liquidator showing that, in his opinion, Western was insolvent from at least 1 July in the year prior, and an estimated return statement showing that Mr. Beveridge does not anticipate being able to pay a dividend to any unsecured creditors.
So Frank, having set the scene, can you take us through in simple terms what a preference payment is and why they exist?
Yes, certainly, Garth. A rationale for unfair preferences stems from the fact that in a liquidation, a company is insolvent, and by definition, they can't pay all of their debts as and when they fall due for payment. So what the Corporations Act does is it encourages insolvent companies to pay their creditors proportionally through a liquidation scheme. And it does this by penalising any creditor who may have received a disproportionate share of those funds, which in this case would be an unfair preference payment. So what happens is it falls on the duty of the liquidator to collect these preference payments and then to distribute the monies proportionally to all the company's creditors. So as you can see there, a company in liquidation, you've got the asset pool, the creditors and the preferred creditor. What happens is if a liquidator is deemed that some of those assets have gone to a preferred creditor through a preference, he or she can claw those back and distribute those to creditors more evenly.
Okay, so having established the theory behind preference payments, what elements need to exist for a preference payment to be clawed back?
Yep. So as you can see here, so in order for a liquidator to successfully recover an unfair preference payment, they must first establish several key elements. So those are that the transaction was between a company and its creditor. The company was insolvent at the time of the preferential payment or became insolvent as a result. The payment to the preferential creditor falls within the relation back period, and for CVL, it's 6 months before the commencement of the liquidation. And the transaction resulted in the creditor receiving more than they would have received in the event of a liquidation. So if the transaction was set aside and the creditor approved in the liquidation.
So how does this all tie back to the case study we started off with, Frank?
Yep. So in background information, so first element, transaction was between the company and its creditor. We noted that Dunkley and Western were both debtor-creditor relationship. So that's that first element that's ticked off. Second element, company's insolvency. We noted that the liquidator did provide a solvency report, and in his opinion, the company was insolvent from at least 1 July in year 2. So that was some months prior to the commencement of the liquidation and the first payment. The payment to the preferential creditor falls within the relation back period. Again, that's that 6-month period before the liquidation date. All the payments from the bank statements that were provided show that they were between the 16th of November and the 15th of May. And then the transaction resulted in the creditor receiving more than they would have in the liquidation. And in the demand, the liquidator did provide an estimated return showing that no dividends were expected to unsecured creditors. So in this instance, the creditor was preferred to other creditors as they aren't receiving anything, and we received, or the client received, $100,000 from the company.
So having established that payments are made, it's not a fait accompli that the liquidator can demand those payments and claw them back. those payments and actions are subject to certain defences that are available to creditors. On your screen at the moment, some of the key defences being that the creditor was a secure creditor at the time, running account defence, the defence of ultimate effect, the good faith defence. You'll see set off there in red. That formerly was a defence, but that defence no longer exists after a ruling in a recent case last year. So I'll hand back to Frank to jump into a bit more detail into a couple of these primary defences.
Thank you, Garth. So the first one that I'll give some further background on is the running account defence. So this is a common defence we see that can create either a partial or complete defence to a preference claim. And I'll show how that sort of works in practice in the next slide. But it applies where there's been a continuous trading business relationship between the creditor and the debtor company throughout that relation back period. It does limit the recovery by the liquidator to the difference between the debt owing at the start and at the end of the relation back period. So the way that works, you'll see here, so there was a meeting between yourself and the client, and you obtained some further information showing all of the payments that were made between Dunkley and Weston between the period of 15th of November in year 2 and 15th of May in year 3. So what you can see in that first table on the left-hand slide is sort of the build-up of the debt in the credit side, which is your invoices for goods, and then the payments against the debt on that, the second row there. So looking at the running account, it changes from $75,000 as a total amount owing in 15th of November in year 2, and by the appointment date, there's $53,000 owing. So what a running account defence allows you to do, it allows you to say, well, yes, we've received we made $100,000 in payments, but what our debt change was we only received a benefit of $23,000 or $22,000 there, which is that 75 less 53. So a $100,000 claim can be reduced to $22,000. There is a little graph there on the right side, which shows sort of the up and down trend of that. The reason why that is there is because there is a previous ability or power that was available to liquidators called the peak indebtedness rule. And what that allowed a liquidator to do is say, well, your debt reached $92,000 on this date. In this instance, it's 1st of February in year 3. At the end of the period, your debt was $53,000. The peak indebtedness rule would allow the liquidator to say your claim is that $40,000, $39,000 difference. That was recently struck down in the High Court, the decision in 2023, which stated that is no longer a power available to a liquidator. So if you do see a liquidator to assert the peak indebtedness rule, it is not allowed anymore, and it is not available to any liquidator. The second defence we'll go through is the good faith defence, which is a very common defence available to preference claims. And that is where there is no grounds for suspecting that the debtor company was insolvent. To be successful, a creditor must prove that the payments were received in good faith, and a lack of good faith would be where there has been a serious threat or other misconduct which prompted the payment or collusion with the company, and the creditor had no grounds for suspecting insolvency, and a reasonable person in the circumstances would have no grounds for suspecting insolvency. So we obtained some further information from Dunkley, which was provided that Mr. Beveridge suggested in his demand that the good faith defence is not applicable to Dunkley, as the payments were rounded sums, all of the same amount, and not directly attributable to specific invoices. And you could see that in the previous slide here, those 4 payments, all $25,000, all rounded amounts, and not attributable to invoices. However, the client did advise you that Western were historically slow payers, and therefore, in or around October of year 2, a payment arrangement was set up in order to reduce the historical debt and allow a degree of certainty for Dunkley with its cash flow budgeting. Western had made all of the payments subject to the arrangements on time, and none of those payments were late. There were no demand letters sent to Western from Dunkley following up payment and threatening enforcement. No further correspondence was received from Western indicating that they had solvency concerns prior to the appointment of Mr. Beveridge, and no evidence was provided. So looking back at the case study, so the first question, is there sufficient evidence to show that Dunkley would have a reasonable ground for suspecting that Western was insolvent during the relation back period? We would say no. The main reason for this is the fact that the payment arrangement, yes, it did allow for rounded sums. However, there was a clear justification for that for cash flow purposes. There was no further demands issued. All the payments were made on time. So we wouldn't think that there would be sufficient evidence to show that they would be reasonable grounds for suspecting that they were insolvent. And then looking at a reasonable person would have no such grounds, we would say, yes, that's correct. So in that instance, the good faith defence would be available to the company, and that would just knock the claim back to nil, as opposed to your running account defence, which would have reduced it to 20K. So in this instance, the advice would be to go for a good faith defence to reduce that claim to zero.
It's worth touching on some safeguards and processes that you or your clients can put in place to reduce the chances of receiving a demand for a preference payment. First of these being working with your clients and possibly putting in place some kind of prepayments process where customers are paying in advance for services provided, or even a cash on delivery type of arrangement. So you're actually not in the business of providing credit to these customers, and therefore not gaining anything in terms of ahead of any other creditors of the company in a liquidation scenario. Secondly, it's taking security. So we saw early on in the presentation a secure creditor that has security over assets that are worth more than their claim at that time. Has sufficient security and therefore has no claim against the company, and a secure creditor can't be pursued for a preference payment. Taking a step beyond the company and seeking personal guarantees from senior personnel, directors, stakeholders to give you that added layer of confidence that if you do suffer a loss through a preference payment being clawed back, you do have that secondary option of pursuing the person individually for that loss. And then lastly, I guess it's take the risk. Money in the hand, a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, I guess is the concept here. You take the cash, you forge on, you operate in good faith and operate within the realms of normal operating conditions. If it all does fall over, the business that you're dealing with does go into liquidation, and you do ultimately receive a demand from a liquidator for a preference, there is always the opportunity to settle those claims, pay a lesser amount that you actually received based on the liquidator incurring costs, time and energy in clawing those back. So there's always the opportunity to settle those claims if it does get to that point, and hence why taking the risk can be the simplest and most straightforward option moving forward. I think most critically is probably your business or your client's business should have a strong documented credit policy, which articulates the steps that your people and staff should take to recover debts and work with your customers that are falling into arrears. If this policy does actually document an escalation in the process and enforcement action that is par for the course and is something that is done regularly, even if you've issued a demand, you still may fall within the bounds of a good faith defence, because all you're doing is following a policy that you adopt for all your creditors. You're doing nothing different, and I guess ultimately means you still have that ability to rely on a good faith defence. You're not going over and above, and so having that documentation there can be a really good ace in your pocket in terms of that defence down the track, and that's something clear and tangible that you can do now to prevent a future hypothetical risk.
Thank you. So I'll finish off here by just going through a checklist that is always good to have should a client or you receive a preference demand from a liquidator. So the first thing is just to check that the liquidator is not out of time. There's a statute bar for this type of demand. So it's 3 years from the relation back date. Check that you did receive the payments claimed by the liquidator. Sometimes there can be similar creditor names. So just check that it is you that received those payments. Verify that the payments were within the permitted time frame. So that relation back period, so 6 months prior to the appointment of the liquidator for a creditor's voluntary liquidation. Seek verification on the insolvency of the company should you have any doubts. So obviously a liquidator may complete a solvency analysis themselves. There's no reason why you can't go out and get an independent verification on the insolvency itself. Consider the running account defence, consider the good faith defence, the secured creditor defence, as the three sort of the main ones that might be available to you. Attempt to settle the claim. It's always better to try and settle it early. Sometimes a liquidator will look to settle a preference claim at a discount just on a commercial basis. These things are expensive to run. If they have to go to court, attempting to settle early is your best bet in reducing this liability. And then if you're in doubt at any stage, seek some independent advice. So we'll finish up here with a little quiz.
So Frank, how far back can a liquidator go from their appointment date to recover payments to unsecured creditors they deem to be preferences?
So with this one, Garth, it's 6 months. This is one that's been touched on a bit throughout the presentation. So with a creditor's voluntary liquidation, it's 6 months from the date of appointment. There is a quirk here if it's a court winding up liquidation, it is actually 6 months from the date of the winding up application was lodged. So there is a further amount of time that can be clawed back there for a liquidator. And this is in relation to an unsecured creditor that is not a related party. There are different rules for different types of creditors there.
So on your screen at the moment is 4 of the options for a defence to a preference payment. Which of these are no longer considered a valid defence to a preference?
So this one is D, set off. So that was the defence that allowed a creditor to claim that what they owed from the company at the time of liquidation could be set off against what they received from a preference prior to the appointment. This is being ruled as not a defence available to creditors any longer.
And then finally, which of the below options are available to safeguard a company from a potential preference payment demand?
So with this one, it's all of the above. So as you went through, trade on cash and delivery basis, security and a PPSR and personal guarantees, they're all options available to creditors to safeguard themselves from a potential preference demand. That's it. Thank you all for listening. Feel free to reach out to anyone in the R&I team at William Buck should you have any queries.